This is episode 581 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Sine die, Wally, sine die.
Yeah, I never do know exactly what that means, but we didn't die this year at the legislature, although it's not a real sweet one, that's for sure.
Well, as usual, it is a session of a lot of bad ideas being proposed, and thankfully, only a few of them made their way through. Uh, a lot that could happen or should happen to improve New Mexico wasn't even discussed. So, not much is going to happen in that regard. In a lot of ways, Jerry Seinfeld's in Albuquerque on Friday night, and I think you know where I'm going with this. It's the show about
Yeah,
nothing.
the session about nothing. So there was a very strong lack of focus for for a state with a lot of problems and a huge budget surplus. Just not a whole lot happened in terms of going. It just And, that's something that, Paul, I was thinking about this. We'll talk more probably at the end of the podcast. Is I just don't think they're doing a good job in the interim sessions. I think it turns into a bunch of dog and pony show, not a serious discussion of policy and what is needed in our state. And then when we get to the session, it just becomes, it becomes almost like a bad dream. You wake up sweating, wondering, what you just experienced and why all of these things come together the way they do.
Well, would I would not disagree with you, although the interns, in my estimation, are mostly road shows for bad ideas.
Yeah.
There's not good bills being discussed, and I think what we have, and broadly speaking, the way the legislature worked this session is that there are some moderate House Democrats who don't follow the progressive line, and they stood up on, and not always successfully, I might add, but HB 41, the clean fuel standard. We'll talk about that, but that was probably the worst single bill that passed. We did a podcast with Todd Myers of the Washington Policy Center uh, that ran earlier this week. We flipped it because wanted to get that information out to people, but rural Democrats were not keen on that. The family the paid family leave SB3, they stood up. They also rebuffed the governor on her plan for mandatory 5-day school weeks. And a lot of rural Democrats voted against the passed and probably adopted HB 129, 7-day waiting period on gun purchases. So it was interesting because the years past, we've generally seen the Senate as being the more moderate body. That's not the case, at least right now, certainly not for this session. Pretty much every bad idea that got a hearing got passed through the Senate. The Senate was more deliberative, it's slower to act, which we welcome, but really, aside from Senator George Munoz, Senate Finance Committee chair, he was the only one willing to stick his neck out on occasion and oppose some of the bad ideas. Whereas you had this group of about 8 or so, 10 or so moderate Democrats who did not go along to get along. And they really, I think, saved New Mexico and really stood up for themselves and their different interests from the more urban Albuquerque, Las Cruces, Santa Fe progressive Democrats.
Yeah, I don't disagree in that it has been a big flop where in the past you used to go to the Senate to try to bring some rationality and look to slow down bad ideas from, and let me just say, everyone has a perspective. And when we say bad ideas, I think you do, Paul. We're talking about, limited government, cost effective, all these things, free market, things that make the American system, where, as you said and alluded to, there's a whole progressive group that they have a way, way, way different vision of what they want the United States and New Mexico in particular to be, and that group uh, has definitely got a stronghold. The other thing is that the ideas that pass in New Mexico, they almost always trot them out like, "Oh, here's a new idea we have." The problem is, and whether it's the clean fuel standard, or whether it's the bill to provide leave if you have a baby or have a healthcare crisis of someone in the family, by the time they make it to New Mexico, those have usually gone through a minimum of a half a dozen to a dozen states, and they're just cutting and pasting things from elsewhere. And I've said the progressive part in particular, it doesn't seem like their issues really ever have very much to do with New Mexico directly. It's kind of a national socialist movement of which New Mexico, unfortunately, is on their concert tour, and they come here eventually, unfortunately, on a lot of these ideas that frankly seldom do any good and frequently do a lot of bad.
Yeah, it's very frustrating to deal with a group of people who, uh, have the opportunity, the true ability to solve the problems, or at least start addressing the serious problems and challenges facing New Mexico, and then to really not undertake anything of note seriously to address these issues. But of course, Democrats have been in power for a vast majority, nearly the entirety, never not in control, only having to deal with a Republican governor or having to deal with a split in the legislative houses. I mean, since 1930, Democrats have ruled New Mexico, and I think their ideas have just played themselves out. There's so few ways that they can really go further that anybody with kind of a willingness to think independently, and I think these rural community representatives are that group that they are just saying, we've done enough. Let's do something that actually will work and not just blindly follow the path of bigger government. Now, that doesn't mean that these rural Democrats are out there proposing the things that need to be done in New Mexico, unfortunately. But I think they just don't believe the progressive path is the way to go every single time. So, the bad news is, of course, that yet another legislative session has passed with a massive, massive budget surplus, and nothing real has been done to improve New Mexico. So, government gets richer, government spends more money, and the rest of us, don't experience the benefits of that. But on the flip side, paid leave, SB3, I think this is the most newsworthy item because it happened just yesterday evening. Valentine's Day, we all got a little bit of a present. Uh, SB3, the Senate version of paid family leave, was killed on the House floor on a oh so narrow 36 to 34 vote against. That means that two theoretically could have switched sides and would have passed the bill. So one vote doesn't get you to the promised land there because it's a tie, but two would have. And this is something we talked about early on this in the session with Carol White. We probably won't see the last of this bill and this idea, although hopefully the election has something to do with that in changing the direction. But boy, it is a victory for businesses, taxpayers, that the Paid Family Medical Leave Act died. And one quick note about that before I hand it over to you, Wally. Uh, the House version had been bottled up in the House Commerce Committee, which had killed last year's version. The Speaker specifically sent this bill to another committee, not to the so-called kill committee. So it wound up that it was on the floor and failed narrowly. So it wasn't just a committee that killed it. It was actually the entire House, which that is huge.
Yeah, it is huge, Paul, and it's interesting that in general, legislative strategy wise, it's like if you get a few committee assignments, that is an indication that your bill is likely to make it to the floor of whichever chamber and pass. But we're seeing now with some of these grandiose, complicated bills, they'll just send them to one committee that does very little work on it. And then you have to do all the heavy lifting on the House floor. And, it's one of those I don't necessarily recommend anybody go get the replay from the Valentine's Day debate on that bill. But, just the questions that come up on the floor because this thing hasn't been vetted in a committee is one of the reasons. It's just people couldn't answer questions about it, and there's so much uncertainty, and it's so complicated. I have so many moving pieces and parts, and then I do think that at the end of the day, I'm not sure if this is what killed it from a legislator point of view, but I do think from why did more business groups support this? Is at the end of the day, it was going to be subject to a rulemaking by Workforce Solutions, the same people that administer, say, the unemployment insurance fund, where it used to be if you quit your job, you didn't get unemployment. You had to be uh, laid off, not terminated for cause or quit voluntarily. And now just everyone who leaves gets it. And, I just don't think there's much confidence in government to have so many loose ends be done by the administrative branch, the bureaucracy during a rulemaking and not addressed by the legislature. So whether that again played a part, I'm not sure from an individual legislator point of view, but boy, the business community certainly knows the pitfalls of throwing things in the bureaucracy in New Mexico.
Yeah, so that was, I would think, pretty much the biggest victory of the session. As usual, a victory in the form of a dead bill. uh, Now, the tax bill is something that we need to go into a little bit because uh, when we left off, I believe, sometimes it's hard to remember exactly where we were last time we talked, but uh, the House had passed their tax bill, I believe, and it was a nothing burger with the income tax bracket shifting that would result in a modest tax reduction of $159 million, essentially starting out, paired with capital gains tax and corporate tax increases. So that's kind of a unified deal with the House and Senate tax bills. And ultimately, the Senate tax bill is what passed. It was concurred in the House, and then it's on the governor's desk. So this is the final deal. The biggest difference is that the Senate added a bunch of provisions in the form of tax credits and various other special interest oriented provisions. We not necessarily a fan of them as a general rule. There's certainly ones that we did not like, such as the governor's EV tax credits, solar tax credits, and some geothermal tax credits. Just a bunch of stuff that is basically a waste of money. Advanced energy tax credit, the usual boondoggle stuff. The tax credits overall in the bill went from about $25 million worth of them to $140 million worth of those credits. So that gets within in shouting distance of the tax brackets reductions. So it's a more expensive bill, but still within the scope of a $3.5 billion budget surplus. It's a trivial amount of money. I mean, we would love to have that $140 million as additional tax relief, but 3.5 billion could have been used so much better. There was, and I think the more interesting thing was there was a Senate amendment by Cliff Pirtle, Senator Pirtle, that would have taken this provision, this bill, and indexed the Social Security tax reductions of 2 years ago. Now, mind you, New Mexico is one of 10 states to even have a Social Security tax. This would have been, and I believe they said $1 million a year, just indexing the rates to inflation so that over time, as we see inflation spiraling at a pretty high rate still, that more and more people don't get trapped in the system. And this should be done for the rest of the state's tax code as well. But the amendment was only for Social Security tax. They voted it down. They voted it down on the Senate floor. And we have receipts. One of the things that's tricky about the Senate is they don't necessarily put everything on the big electronic board like they do in the House. So I had to go back to the webcast, and you can do this for anything. Go back to the webcast debate and actually seek out the roll call votes, because it's not listed on the legislature's website. At least we couldn't find it anywhere, and find out who voted for and against indexing the Social Security tax to inflation. Again, this was the Senate. I just mentioned the Senate, kind of the more progressive body this session. It was voted down 20-15, which would obviously imply that some senators did not vote on the issue. No Democrats voted in support of indexing Social Security taxes to inflation, which is just, it's mind-blowing. You had several that chose to not vote on the issue, but ultimately indexing the Social Security tax to inflation died on a 20-15 vote, with all the Democrats who voted in opposition. And we've never been, just to clarify, of the ilk that Social Security tax reduction or eliminating the Social Security tax, this is not at the core of our economic development strategy. We can do other things and do more with that money, but this is a very simple, very good government-oriented thing that we don't want to trap more people in a tax due to inflation. We have the money. It's incredibly minuscule in terms of the costs. But it just shows you that this group, especially on the Senate side, just cannot bring themselves to sympathize with the taxpayers on these issues. Just sad.
Yeah, and then you never know what the deep down goals of anyone involved with any of these things are. But one of the things that New Mexico has the potential for is to be a destination for retirees that bring their
Absolutely.
pension, their Social Security. And one of the things, and you see these websites all the time, it's like the best states to retire in, and they always have a place, whether it's a chart or in prose, of whether or not a state taxes Social Security. And so New Mexico used to be, yes, they do. Now we're an asterisk. And, another way of saying it is, for just a little bit more money, we could be a no, we don't tax Social Security. And that could be, a pretty substantial economic driver, one that's way more likely to pay for that $1 million or a couple $1 million extra of taxes than something like, say, the film subsidies would be to the state of New Mexico. But yeah, I'm with you, Paul. It's not the biggest thing in the world, but it seems like that one is like, boy, if you're not going to ease up on the reins of taxation now, with this kind of surplus in the state treasury, can you ever bring yourself to do it? So
Yeah. And even though it is a small amount of money, we did rank it as a uh, +6 vote in the Freedom Index because of what I think it so clearly says about the people who voted against it and their views on whose money is it? Where does it belong to? is returning money to the people of New Mexico a good, or should government try to hold on to every last cent? And I think we've seen that time and time again, but rarely are there votes taken on the floor of either body that so clearly illustrate this fact. And we talked about last week the House on the same tax provision, the 1% across the board income tax amendment that Representative Townsend put forth, and that failed on a party line vote. Again, you have a $3.5 billion budget surplus. $1.75 billion would be lost to government to reduce the personal income tax to 1% across the board. And yet New Mexico then would be at the top of every list, suddenly on the radar as being a state that is serious about attracting individuals, attracting businesses. You mentioned retirees on the Senate side with this Social Security tax provision. Those are the kinds of things that ultimately lead to stronger economic growth and broader economic prosperity. And yet, again, we have the receipts. They are part of the Freedom Index, and we're happy to be able to put some of these amendments in there. They really, I think, separate the wheat from the chaff even more thoroughly on who's voting for freedom and who's not within the legislature. So do go check out the Freedom Index. It's not necessarily finalized, but it is very close to being finalized. We just want to make sure that there's no loose ends. But the votes that we've talked about, HB 41, SB 3, some of these amendments, and then some other spending provisions in the budget, et cetera. Those are top priorities. The 5-day school week mandates, and some good news. The budget that passed through the Senate, that was essentially moved forward as the joint legislative budget, also prohibits the governor from essentially implementing the 5-day school week mandate. The 4-day week will be allowed unless the governor kind of takes on both bodies of the legislature and says, no, I'm going to line item this and impose the 5-day school week regardless. So that, watch that. We'll be watching that as we hit the signing period. And it's the Freedom Index really has, I think, the most thorough and certainly the most timely data available for people who are interested in their legislative officials and seeing how they're voting. And if you know who those rural Democrats are, I promise you, you can pick out the trend lines and see who are the ones that are scoring close to zero, and who are the ones that are piling up 40, 50, and even 60 points into the negative on the Freedom Index. So let's see. One additional item. I was up in Santa Fe this week, had a unique opportunity to see Riley Gaines and see her joined by my oldest daughter. So 3 daughters could have come. I only had one in tow, the one who's most inclined to, be interested in Riley Gaines. And she actually wrote an essay in school about Riley Gaines. For those who don't know, Riley Gaines is a University of Kentucky competitive swimmer who was pushed out essentially by Leah Thomas, a male who was swimming as a female in competitive collegiate races. And Riley Gaines, really has become one of the primary faces of the effort to preserve women's sports. So that was a very neat experience. And there's been some reporting on that. Unfortunately, according to Riley Gaines, she was unable to get a meeting with Governor Lujan Grisham.
Yeah, Paul, I have lots of daughters in my life, and this whole thing about trans. I watched I watched the Iowa Hawkeyes women's basketball game this weekend, and Caitlin Clark has really brought a lot of excitement and a ton of attendance to NCAA women's basketball. But it's a very delicate sport, and you put somebody who achieved puberty as a male in there with them, and it just is not going to be something that I think most people are going to want to watch, and I certainly don't think it's fair in any way, shape, or form to women. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be a place for people who identify differently to play, but that's one that it's pretty clear cut. Just when you see it, we're starting to see more and more ridiculousness about what goes on with regard to having males at birth somehow then be able to play on in female sporting events.
Yeah, so I don't know if we will wind up with a special session or any kind of additional activity at the Roundhouse. That was my last journey up there to Santa Fe. Didn't take the Rail Runner a single time this year. Well, it just never worked out. Last year, the 60-day session, of course, being a longer session, spending more time in Santa Fe because of the nature of that session, and rode the train a handful of times. This time around, just didn't work out. The budget does go up. Government spending, the general fund will, assuming that the governor doesn't veto large amounts of the budget, which I would doubt. $10.919 billion. So this is the first ever general fund that's north of $10 billion. So we're growing, government growing as it goes, as is the case here in New Mexico. Again, that's about a 650-ish million dollar budget increase year over year. Those tax reductions were $150 million total. That's not including the impact of those tax hikes, and certainly kind of not looking at those tax credits one way or the other. We rated, by the way, the tax bill as a zero. We continued that, even though the Senate, I think, worsened the bill by certainly the EV credits and whatnot. It was overall still a net tax reduction regarding the personal income tax. And, it's hard for us to say we can't, we would support or put a negative number associated with a net tax reduction in real taxes, not just those tax credits. But
Hey, Paul, and I lost track of it. How much do I get if I buy a new electric vehicle from the state of New Mexico? Do you have that number off
it
the head?
depends on the amount of money you make, I think.
Okay, yeah, it's indexed to income, so
Yeah. And quite frankly, the charger tax credit was the more generous aspect of that particular provision. So yeah, it's another way that and I would have to find it in
and it's just one of those. People weren't talking a lot about that, at least where I was going, so I lost track of that one during the session. How big those credits actually were. So
yeah, it was. Let's see here. I've got it because it's just a matter of trolling through all of my blog posts about EVs. EV is a simple way to find it. So $3,000 starting out for 3 years. So it's not related to income, it's related to time. So for 3 years, it'll be a $3,000 vehicle subsidy. And then it goes down over time, 2,200, 1,470 by 2028. By 2029, it'll be $960. I guess the assumption is that we're all going to be driving EVs by this time. So the credit drops a little. The bigger subsidy is the $25,000 to purchase and install a charging station. That's a much more generous. That's essentially a credit for the entire installation of the EV charging system.
Does that include home charging stations, Paul?
Yeah,
Can you tell?
yeah,
Yeah,
that,
so that to do an overnight charge, I think in most homes that could handle it, and if the electric distribution system in the area can handle it, that should be enough to pay for that thing. So
right, exactly. That's almost a tax credit that pays for the
yeah,
entire cost of the installation. Whereas, and I don't remember what exactly the federal credit is, but you're still paying for the electric vehicle. I mean, $3,000 is quite honestly not that great when you're talking about the cost of an electric vehicle relative to the cost of a traditional vehicle. Now combining it with the federal subsidies, combining it with the car dealers are going to be very highly motivated to get these vehicles off the lot.
yeah,
So
because they're not selling very
yeah,
well,
so
and
you could have some favorable deals on EVs moving forward. That's certainly within the realm of possibility if folks are in the market for them. But quite frankly, the zeitgeist continues to, I think, turn against electric vehicles in a broad sense of the word. So, in summary, uh, another session that really, I think, could have gone to great use, great improvements in the state of New Mexico, comes back as basically a waste of time. Oh, the oil and gas, aside from the clean fuel standard, did not get nearly as hit as they could have. The royalty rate, HB 48, that passed one of the bodies, I believe the House, and wound up not being adopted. So there was a lot of bad ideas in this session and a lot of things that wound up not moving forward. So could have been worse, but especially with that budget surplus, it needs to be better. We're not going to make a dent in our poverty rates. We're not going to make a dent in our educational challenges and outcomes. We're not going to make a dent in diversifying our economy and supplementing oil and gas as a economic driver of our state. And if the industry eventually does see, a downturn, or somehow one of these green technologies actually are effective and reduce the demand for oil and gas in some substantive way, the fact is that we're still basically an oil and gas driven state, and that has only grown more intensive in recent years. So, uh, not a great session, but we are glad that it's done. And really, now our attention, like so many others, focuses on November. And of course, the presidential race is critical, but right up there, right as important for New Mexicans is all 112 of these legislators are up. And certainly that Social Security vote seems like one that if I'm running for a Senate seat and my opponent voted against it, I think that is
and there are any people above the age of 65 or 67 in my district, which
yeah,
little tongue in cheek there. That's pretty much every district. So
yeah, that's an 80-20 issue, and there's
Yep.
a lot of other good red meat to hold people to account this from this session.
Yeah.
Anything else, Wally?
Well, yeah, just New Mexico has always said if we just had more money, we could solve our problems. And they, so far, they have more money than when that sentiment was very popular. We have more money now than could have ever almost been imagined. But what's lacking right now is a vision for how to spend and invest that. And believe me, some of that spending and investing could come back, and I think should come back in the form of tax reductions, restructuring of the gross receipts tax. But just one little thing is, they New Mexico, just because of how it's structured, there's a lot of oil and gas money that's allocated to capital. And the way they've done that is they have a $5 billion of capital allocations that have been made to various entities that remains unspent. So we can't, it's almost like we can't even spend money in New Mexico. And so a lot of times the legislature kicks in money and then looks for a match, they look for entities to get the rest somewhere. I think it's time in New Mexico. This thing has needed to be reformed for a long time. But I think instead of being the first money in, I think the state should always be the last money in, being the only money the state should ever put towards a capital project is if that amount that's allocated there would put the project over the top and then give them a year, two, three, whatever they need to make that happen. But to have $5 billion unspent that's allocated, and so it's not helping people in any way, shape, or form. And gosh, Paul, even when you just talk about make work or pork or whatever, we're not even doing that well. So it's the worst of all worlds. We've taken 5 billion out of the economy. It's sitting on the sideline, and we're doing nothing with it. We're not building with it. We're not returning it to the taxpayers. And that's just one of the main items. That mindset is that we need some visionary thinking, because they say the right things. We want to diversify our economy, and then the policies they put into place don't make sense. They say we want to make our streets safe, and boy, there was very scant amount of work done on that. They want to improve education, very little about that. And we just seem like we do a lot of these I don't know, they're almost vanity projects about doing a clean fuel standard. Whoop-de-doo, that's a lot of money in for very little clean fuel coming out. And New Mexico deserves better. I think we can get better, but I'm not seeing how that's going to necessarily get from point to A to point B anytime soon, based on what's been going on in our state.
Yeah, and you see these budgets, and for example, 10.19 billion this year, 9.57 billion last year, 8.4 the year before, and they don't add up. Literally, they don't add up in the sense that we've had these $3.5 billion budget surpluses the last 2 years with the significant surplus the year before. What they do, and this is a bipartisan problem, and I read and quote, I love Bill Scherer from Farmington to to death. The guy is a great guy, but he's quoted in the Source, New Mexico article about this budget situation, saying there's a difference between investing the money and squandering the money. No, there's not really. I mean, yeah, there's starting more government programs versus putting money into yet another savings account of the state. But Republicans need to be, like Townsend, like Jim Townsend on the floor of the House, a 1% across the board income tax. Republicans need to be in the here and now party, saying we need this money right now to improve upon the challenges facing New Mexico. And the title of this article, for those who want to see it, because it's actually very relevant, New Mexico, you are not a poor state. I think that was George Munoz, Senate Finance Committee chair. And I'll just reiterate, no, we are not a poor state. Emphasis on state. We are a poor state from the average person and the amount of money they make and the way that we measure poverty and human flourishing relative to other states, the United States, our education system, our crime, the things that we should be doing with this money, we're not doing with this money because we have elected people who don't understand how to prioritize. Now, I think a world with Bill Scherer as the governor or having real influence in New Mexico's public policy debates, it's a much better world and it's much better economy. But continuing to fund these quote unquote savings accounts. You and I, Wally, we need to save money because there's going to be a time in our lives when we're not going to be able or wanting to work anymore. We're going to retire on those dollars and hopefully live out the rest of our lives traveling and enjoying life. The state of New Mexico has no need for that kind of retirement because the state of New Mexico always has money flowing into it and always has people who will take money out of it. It's simply not the same situation we're setting up where the state of New Mexico is, quite frankly, able to operate independently of the money that flows into it from the taxpayers. And that is not a healthy environment. It's not the way government was intended to work. And we are a state that has needs right now. The needs not being discussed, not being debated in the legislature. And I think if the conservative movement in this state wants to win elections, they need to put out bold messaging. And quite frankly, I wasn't a big fan of Ron Ketty's rebate plan. I think he should have talked about actual tax reform and reduction that makes New Mexico a more attractive place. So this is not just about Democrats doing bad things, not having a vision. It's also about conservatives coming together and providing a vision for what New Mexico could be. And if you listen to the show, I think you see that we have a vision here. I wish the vision translated into some of the policymakers in our state.
Yeah, the money's flowing in, but it's not flowing to things that are really improving the state. Now, when you talk about having less money flow in, that's that's crazy talk. That's just Santa Fe cannot handle that. But they've got to get a handle on the money they have and do something with it, because not to take in vain a Bible verse, but we're poor in spirit. But boy, we have a lot of money in our coffers there in Santa Fe.
Yeah, and I know this is going to really surprise you, but some of that $10.19 billion that the government spends is not only not useful, it's not spent well. It's
counterproductive. It's things are worse off because part of it's spent. So
yeah. So and same with those tax credits, which it's a tough one for us because we never met a tax cut we didn't like, but tax credits are very often, almost usually, special interest targeted. They're not for the benefit of the average person. They're not going to drive economic prosperity forward. They forego revenue on a certain area of the economy, predominantly in this state, the environment and EVs and whatnot. It's just not an effective forswearing of those dollars. So anyway, we will get back to normal schedule in terms of the shows and their release, and we'll have plenty to talk about when the governor starts signing and vetoing bills, and we'll watch that process, see what she does on some of these topics. But thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.